I know you've been hearing about science, and we're going to move to social science, and I know you've been hearing about global governance and global institutions, and so I'm going to sort of take us down to a very local level and look at structural injustice at the very local level, at the bottom of the economic pyramid. So my remarks will be in 4 parts. I'm going to talk first about some underlying assumptions of the Wego Network, about the links between employment, poverty, and structural injustices. And in part, this lays the context for why we think impact is actually so difficult, because there's so many countervailing forces making the kinds of impact we want really quite difficult. Then I'll give an illustrative case of how this plays out at the city level, and the case is for street vendors among the working poor. Then I'll say a bit about the Wego Network's approach to conceptualizing, pursuing, and measuring impact by sharing our sort of model of action and our model of change. And then end with some thoughts on the role for academia and a final vision statement of where the Wego Network, at least, would like to see the future of the economy. I should just say that as the introduction by Louis, thank you, suggests, I've been an activist practitioner and now I'm an activist academic, and arguably I have 1 foot or maybe just 1 toe anymore in academia. I do still teach and I do still do research, but I am 24/7 running a global network. So underlying assumptions, the first set are the links between employment and poverty. Employment is the primary source of income for the poor. There's just no getting around that. Employment, therefore, is the primary channel through which the benefits of growth, of income growth, can be widely distributed. We're not saying it is widely distributed, but it could be. And employment is the primary channel through which income poverty, at least, can be reduced. And yet, I think we were quite stunned, in fact, to find that the original articulation of the MDGs around 2000, there was no goal on employment. There wasn't even a target on employment. There was 1 indicator on employment under the gender equity goal, which we problematized. We didn't think it was the right one. And so we were very happy in the 2005 UN Summit document to see decent work and productive employment appear in, if my memory serves me, paragraph 46. And this was due to real efforts by the ILO, but the reason we were also pleased is we had been working with UNIFEM and UNDP and ILO to try to get employment onto the agenda. And so we have a big question mark about where employment will end up in the post-2015 agenda, but we think global crises have led to global attention, because with the Great Recession and then the concern about youth unemployment, employment is more on the agenda than in 2000. The second set of assumptions are about informal employment, which is my area of expertise, and poverty. And what we know, and we've been tracking this for quite some time, is that there is a significant but not complete overlap between being informally employed and being poor. And I've circulated a handout because I didn't want to go into a lot of factual details. But first of all, most workers in the developing world are informally employed, well over half, as high as 94% in India, a country I know well. And most working poor, an even higher percent of the working poor, are engaged in the informal economy. Also, and this goes contrary to many widespread assumptions, most informal workers are poor. And if you look at the pyramid part of the handout, It has 6 segments of the informal economy. The tip is the self-employed who hire others. And that is the only group, based on official data, that on average are not poor. All the other groups are poor. We also know now that the self-employed who hire others, the employer group, represent less than 10% of the informal workforce in all countries where we have data, and actually represents less than 5% of the total informal workforce in most countries. The only countries in which it's more than 5, less than 10, is in East Asia and China. So they're a very small group, and that's the only group that on average is not poor. And why is this? Well, we know from our research and the statistical data that we compile and analyze that incomes are low, yes, but also costs and risks are high. Again, contrary to widespread economic assumptions. And of course, economic rights and legal and social protections are very limited in the informal economy, and also bargaining power and representative voice, which we think are absolutely essential to reducing poverty. This one's a bit more complex because it's looking at the structural injustices that we see in the informal economy. And this is our area of expertise. This is why we feel it's so hard to actually get the kind of impact that the donors and the funders want us to show. First of all, mainstream models, mainstream laws, mainstream policies are biased systematically towards formal firms and formal workers. Neoclassical models of labor markets assume people are either employed or they're unemployed, and if they're employed, it's formal wage employment. The models completely exclude self-employment, which represents half of the labor force in a country like India. And it excludes informal wage employment, which is the part of the informal economy that's growing around the world. Labor law most everywhere assumes a recognized, explicit employer-employee relationship. Again, labor law therefore excludes the self-employed unless you have clever lawyers who figure out ways to extend labor law. And it excludes, even in developed countries, ambiguous, disguised, third-party employment relationships. Economic policies, very biased towards formal firms, to the great disadvantage of informal firms and informal livelihoods, often undermining them, in fact. Another major concern of ours is that mainstream economic thinking, and as you know, the discipline of economics rules in issues relating to the economy, it actually stigmatizes the informal economy and stigmatizes the informal workforce, and with it, therefore, the working poor. So in mainstream economic thinking, the informal economy is the result of a distortion. It's a distortion, in fact. It's the result of excessive labor regulations. Or the informal economy is a drag on the economy. It's associated with low productivity, ergo a problem. The informal workers themselves, remember most of them are working poor, are evading registration and taxation. They might be downright illegal or criminal. They're non-productive, and even this is what the private sector loves to argue, is that they represent some kind of unfair competition because the informal firms avoid paying high rent, high utility costs. They get away with paying much less. In fact, our data show that they actually pay more for much less regular supply of electricity and other utilities. So how do these structural injustices in the informal economy relate to poverty reduction? The two key drivers of structural injustice that we look at in our work are, one, the global production system, the long global value chains of production, which we can characterize as long, complex chains. And here, the private sector dominance is through the multinational companies that can avoid labor regulations and, as you've been discussing yesterday, avoid taxes in various ways. We also are very concerned about urban renewal and urban infrastructure projects, which are very popular, heavily funded these days. And these are literally a juggernaut. They literally crush things in their path. And I will show you an example from a city in India. And here, it's private companies, and particularly the real estate developers that are sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and colluding with government, and in the acquisition and also the allocation of urban land, which is essential to urban livelihoods of the poor. So our premise on poverty reduction is that supply-side interventions and redistribution after growth alone will not be able to compensate for the costs of these structural adjustments. And so the structural injustices themselves have to be tackled, and the poor have to be empowered to hold government accountable to be able to bargain effectively with the private sector. So let me move then to the illustrative case of street vendors. We all know that they're the most visible part of the urban informal economy. We see them all. Sometimes we buy from them, sometimes they pester us and we see them as a nuisance, but they're there. Until maybe 5 years ago, nobody had ever estimated how many there were. And we've been working with data analysts and the national statistical systems, and we now have estimates in 11 cities, 10 countries. And what we know, two countries that the Wego Network works in a lot, India and South Africa. In India, street vendors represent 11% of total urban employment in modern India. Now, remember, in urban areas, that's where you expect to see a lot of formal employment. Overall, 80% of total employment, urban employment in India is informal. And of that, 11% are street vendors. And in South Africa, they represent 15% of the total urban workforce. But they lack economic rights, and they lack voice and bargaining power. So what happens? What they want is a secure place to vend. They very seldom have it. They know that there are rights and responsibilities, and they would like public land to be allocated in fair and reasonable ways. We've developed a concept called natural markets. This is where you see large concentrations of street vendors in cities around the world. And it's always in areas where there's significant pedestrian traffic flow. So transport hubs, commercial centers, hospitals and schools, places of worship, residential colonies, you'll see them. And these natural markets have come about not just because the street vendors want to be there, but the pedestrian customers also buy from them. And we think these should be built into urban plans. And if they are assigned to a sort of market area, which often they are when they're relocated, the street vendors would like some basic infrastructure services at those places. I had a student do a study of the main food market where it was like a wholesale market, informal, where all the food grain from a country in Africa came in. I forget which one now. But her study was the market was doing all of the wholesale commerce, and it had no infrastructure. There was no water, there were no latrines. There was a roof sort of shed, but nothing else. On top of that, street vendors are subject to everyday forms of harassment. We know that there's a famous scholar here who looked at everyday forms of resistance. Well, there's everyday forms of harassment. And so they are charged fees, the police extract bribes, their goods are confiscated, they're evicted, and there are a lot of arbitrary warrants and evictions and convictions. We track online, Google search once a week, all the news articles in English. No, we do it in multiple languages, actually, on street vendors, all the 4 groups we work with, street vendors being one of them. And there's an eviction, forced eviction every day somewhere in the world of street vendors. It's just a daily occurrence. And they lack any voice and bargaining power to be able to negotiate with the city government or the police or the national government or the wholesalers and retailers that they have to buy goods from or negotiate space with. So the question is, who sets the rules and in whose interests? And of course, the city, the local government in this case, is the big player. And the 2 big policy debates are around location, relocation, and around licensing. And it's a question of how urban space should be allocated. We're calling for a revisit of the notion of commons, urban commons, for an analog for sustainable livelihoods in rural areas, for sustainable livelihoods in urban areas. And the question is, what gets decided and what is the process by getting there? The common stance is that it's the role of the state to control and govern access to public space, and public space should be used as a vehicle for investment. That's a very common. So there's this sort of collusion with real estate developers. The policy implications are that the city should strictly regulate access to the urban spaces, and the vendors, therefore, ergo, need to be relocated. A pro-poor stance that we're arguing is that the public space is the right of everyone, this bringing back the notion of the commons. The right to the city, there are campaigns for this. We're part of something called the World Class Cities for All campaign. The World Class Cities even should allow some of the public space for the informal workers. And we feel that vendors should participate in defining what is a natural market, and cities should try to protect these natural markets and incorporate them into the city plans. Licensing is the other big policy debate. And the common stance is that it's the role of the state to allocate licenses to conform with their policy positions. In fact, it's often in compliance, it's right before elections, and it's political cronyism who gets, specific groups get the licenses. The pro-poor stance is all vendors have the right to a license. Keep the license issue separate from the permit issue, because if you have a license, at least you will not be treated as a criminal. In India, if you don't have a license, you are treated under the penal code, and the street vendors I know can rattle off which articles of the penal code they get harassed under by the police and the city. It's not moving down. Oh, there it is. Okay. So let me just share the example of Ahmedabad, India. It's in the western state of Gujarat. It's a city that I know quite well. It has an estimated 80,000 vendors. Some people put it a bit higher. And around 100 of these natural markets that I've talked about. And it's the home, the founding home and headquarters of this remarkable self-employed women's association. How many have heard of SEWA? Yeah, quite a few, okay. That's where SEWA was born and still headquartered. And SEWA has a lot of women street vendors in its membership in Ahmedabad and elsewhere. So it's keeping track of what's happening to street vendors under these big urban renewal infrastructure projects that have come into urban India over the last decade. I've got figures from SEWA for what they know of how many vendors have been evicted in 3 out of these major projects. There are others. The riverfront development dislodged the livelihoods of 77,000 households. That's a big separate story. Anyway, model roads where you have big sort of lanes for the vehicular traffic, very narrow pathways, and no vending. So far, 5,000 and more have been evicted. The bus rapid transport system in Ahmedabad, the first phase, so many miles of it, have displaced 2,000 vendors. And the Budra Fort Heritage Plaza, the Budra Fort is the fort palace of the Sultan who founded Ahmedabad in 1411, and in front of the fort, which has been derelict for some time, and the walls to the old city, there's a natural market of 4,000 vendors. And they were all displaced because the city decided to create a heritage plaza. When I was there in January, February this year, working alongside a street vendor for 2 days, I climbed up on the ramparts of the fort and looked down, and there was not one worker in this cordoned off construction place. And she said, they haven't been working on it, but it's been cordoned off, and the 4,000 vendors are crowded into streets and alleyways around what was their natural market. And there's an estimate that I found that the turnover in that natural market was worth, on an annual basis, about 1 billion rupees, or 20 million US dollars. So not an insignificant part of the economy. Consider Davy Ben. Davy Ben was the host for myself and Michael Piori of MIT. We were part of an exposure dialogue to look at how law impinges on these workers. And we spent 2 days and 2 nights working alongside and living in the house of Davy Ben. And this is a picture of her taking the goods she sells back to where she stores them, which is really on a street corner under a tarp. And she's one of the 4,000 that was evicted from the Budra Fort Natural Market. She and her family and her husband's clan had lived for over 150 years in an artist colony, an artisan colony really, in what is now New Ahmedabad. The New Ahmedabad sort of grew up around it. If anyone knows Ahmedabad, Gulbai Tekra, and it was an artisan group that makes clay and now plaster of Paris murtis, or images for festivals and temples. And they were one of the model roads cut right through Gulbai Tekra. It was also known as Hollywood because it was so picturesque and the women were so beautiful. So it's sort of known as the Hollywood of Ahmedabad, but they cut right through it. So Davy Ben and her family have had to cut back on expenditures. She even confessed that she no longer drinks tea during the day because she can't afford to buy it. And these are long work days in the hot sun. And she asked Michael and I, aren't we part of the heritage, part of the culture of the city? And we, of course, could only but agree, but we also really had no good answer for her. So the Wego Network, very quickly. Just to say, we're a 17-year-old global network. We have activities members, partners in about 50 countries. We have a team of 35 in 12 countries. And we are a membership organization. We have organizations of these workers. We have researchers and statisticians. The academic community is one constituency. And then practitioners, development practitioners, are the third. And I just want to illustrate our approach with the case of street vendors. The 3 things that we really aim to do is to increase voice, increase visibility, and for the sake of a third V, increase validity, which is legitimacy of these workers, and to fight the stigmatized image of them. So increased voice, we do this through organization and representation. So this is where I said I only have a foot in the door in academia. We really are part of a social movement, not just a think tank. And so we do help find organizations of these workers and link them up by sector. So we were instrumental at the beginning founding of StreetNet International, which is an international alliance of street vendor organizations with national affiliates in 40 countries. And we help create policy platforms for street vendors to be able to negotiate with cities. We also train them how to negotiate, because we've really literally had to tell them shouting and yelling doesn't work. You have to be credible in your negotiations, and we also provide the statistics and other information they need. So that's where increased visibility through official statistics and research. We're very committed to improving labor force and other economic statistics, official. And we work with the ILO. I heard the previous session, the WHO, it's hard for civil society to work with. It's a little easier in ILO because it's tripartite, although there is an antibody to NGOs, but we've figured out a way to be seen as credible technical NGO. So we work with the ILO and the UN statistics, and we have been able to generate estimates from official statistics. And then, of course, we undertake research of various kinds in multiple countries. The increased validity is to make them legitimate, seen as legitimate economic actors, not illegal or criminal. And so we convene policy dialogues with city governments and urban planners. We hold these exposure dialogues, very serious way to test theory and reality. We've done it with a group of economists for 7 years, and then the Bridging Perspectives book was the outcome of that. And we're now doing it with judges and lawyers. And then we document good practice. One of our colleagues calls it possibility thinking. The planners and the city officials need to know that something is possible, and then they'll sort of sit up and listen. The model of change, and this is our conceptualization and measurement of change and the pursuit of it as well. The 3 V's are there on the left, and we see these as the enabling conditions to make whatever else happens through the arrows happen. And the first thing we want is that policymakers and various kinds of practitioners, I can't even read my slide right here, have increased or informed understanding and also changed mindsets. We find mindsets are really the big barrier when it comes to talking with planners and others. And then if that happens, we feel you can get to transforming models and systems and the rules of the game. And then only can you have impact at the level of the worker. So we keep telling the funder, we can't have impact overnight on workers unless you change this whole complex, wider environment. And then as you'll see, we can see countervailing forces coming in all the time. So ones that are affecting street vendors right now, wherever we are studying it, is the Great Recession has continued. There's not as much demand and purchasing power for them. And meanwhile, inflation has come in, just compounding things. So in India, the price of onion is sort of the emblematic thing of inflation. It doesn't just affect the consumer, it affects the street vendor who can't increase the price. He has to buy it from the wholesaler, or she has to. And, but she can't pass along that increased price. So her margins go down, and sometimes they're even negative. So the role for, because of time, I'll just move on. The role for academia, certainly there's this important role that you've been hearing about for the last day and a half about external outreach. And the research that's done contributes to that informed understanding. The advocacy that I've heard talked about hopefully is changing mindsets, and the alliances and consortia that have been talked about I think are really needed to have the institutional reform. I don't think it comes with a single organization. And so I think the participants here should be really acclaimed for what they're doing. But I do think we also have to look internally and really to test our theories and rethink our teaching to ensure they reflect the ground reality of poverty today, but also the political economy of poverty today. Are our theories applicable in all contexts? Are they still relevant today? Do they reflect the fast-changing world? And as you could hear, our network is particularly concerned about urban planning theory and neoclassical economic theory. And teaching, can we teach our students better? How much of our teaching is cross-disciplinary? How much do we really introduce multiple perspectives? When we're teaching economics, do we say what the heterodox position is as well as the orthodox position? Field studies, I lament the loss, I'm an anthropologist, but I lament the loss of field studies as a requirement in PhD work. For two things, you get the ground reality, you also know how hard it is to get data, and therefore how bad a lot of the data is, and yet data rules the world. And exposures like the exposure dialogues, I think, are critical. And finally, a vision statement for the future of the world's economy. And this comes from Ela Butt, the founder of SEWA, who was the founding chair of Wego Network, and who, I should add, has gotten an honorary degree at Yale and also at the university that I represent. And so her statement is, the challenge is to convince the policymakers to promote and encourage hybrid economies in which micro businesses can coexist along small, medium, and large businesses, in which the street vendors can coexist alongside the kiosks, retail shops, and large malls. Just as the policymakers encourage biodiversity, they should also encourage economic diversity. Also, they should try to promote a level playing field in which all sizes of businesses and all categories of workers can compete on equal and fair terms. Thank you.